Fine. Let's start. Number 12. The Lightning Strike. November 14th, 1969. It is raining at Cape Kennedy. The sky is the color of wet concrete, and sitting on top of a Saturn V rocket are three men who are about to have the worst 30 seconds of their careers before they even leave the state of Florida. The rocket lifts off. Everything is normal. Pete Conrad, the commander, is calling out the numbers. And then, about 36 seconds into the flight, the whole spacecraft lights up. Here's the thing nobody tells you about a rocket. A Saturn V, climbing through a rain cloud, drags a tail of hot, ionized exhaust behind it that is thousands of feet long. That trail is basically a giant electrical wire reaching all the way back down to the ground. And on that damp November morning, it did exactly what a giant wire in a storm does. It invited a lightning strike. Twice. Once at about 36 seconds, and again around 52 seconds. Inside the command module, the world fell apart. Every warning light on the panel came on at once. Later, Conrad said it looked like the entire caution and warning array had decided to throw a party. All three fuel cells, the things making their electricity, dropped offline. The guidance platform tumbled. And down in Houston, the telemetry, the stream of data that lets the ground see what the spacecraft is doing, turned into complete garbage. Numbers scrolling into nonsense. Now picture the flight control room. You have a rocket already in the air, 3 astronauts aboard, and your screens have gone to static. This is the exact moment where missions die and people with them. And then a 24-year-old kid saves everybody. His name was John Aaron. He was the flight controller watching the electrical systems, and he had seen this precise pattern of garbage data exactly once before, during an obscure test more than a year earlier that almost nobody else had bothered to remember. He recognized the fingerprint of it, and he made a call so strange that most of the people in the room, including the flight director, had no idea what he was talking about. He said, "Switch SCE to auxiliary." The signal conditioning equipment, a small box almost nobody thought about. The call went up to the crew, and here is the second miracle. Only one man on board, Alan Bean, even knew where that switch was. He reached over, flipped it, and the data came back. The fuel cells were brought back online, and Apollo 12, a mission that had been about 10 seconds from an abort, simply carried on and flew to the moon. No injuries. No headlines screaming about how close it was. Just a slightly damp launch that most people remember, if they remember it at all, as the one after Apollo 11. The margin between a footnote and a catastrophe was one man's memory of one forgotten test. And that is where we are starting, because it only gets thinner from here. Number 11. The Heat Shield Warning. February 20th, 1962. John Glenn is about to become the first American to orbit the Earth, and for most of the flight, everything is glorious. 3 orbits. Sunrises every 90 minutes. The famous fireflies drifting past his window. It is a good day. Then a light comes on in mission control that nobody wanted to see. It was called Segment 51. A single telemetry signal, and what it was quietly suggesting was this: that the landing bag behind Glenn's heat shield had deployed early. And if the landing bag had deployed, that meant the heat shield underneath it might no longer be locked in place. You need to understand what the heat shield does. On re-entry, the capsule slams into the atmosphere, and the air in front of it compresses into a wall of plasma that reaches thousands of degrees. The heat shield is the only thing between that inferno and John Glenn. If it were loose, if it peeled away at the wrong moment, he would be cremated in his seat in front of the whole world. So the controllers had a decision, and they did not have long to make it. Normally, after the retro rockets fire to slow you down, you jettison the spent retro pack, the bundle of rockets strapped across the front of the shield. But someone realized that the metal straps of that retro pack ran right across the heat shield, and might, just might, help hold it on. So they made a call that broke the normal procedure. They told Glenn to keep the retropack on, re-enter with it still strapped to the front of the ship. What they did not fully tell him, at least not plainly, was why. Glenn started down, and as he hit the atmosphere, the retropack began to burn and break apart, and flaming chunks of it came flying past his window. He watched pieces of glowing debris streak by, and he did not know, in that moment, whether he was watching harmless bits of the retropack or the first pieces of his own heat shield tearing away. He just sat there, inside a fireball, and waited to find out if he was going to live. He famously said, "This is Friendship 7. That was a real fireball, boy." The shield held. Glenn splashed down alive. And then the engineers looked at the data and discovered the punchline, if you can call it that. The heat shield had never been loose at all. Segment 51 was a faulty sensor, a bad switch. The reading was wrong. He flew the most frightening re-entry of the early space age, watching fire go past his face and wondering if he was about to die, over a problem that did not exist. That is the part that stays with you. Sometimes the emergency is real, and sometimes the emergency is just a lie told by a broken wire, and it cost a man the same terror either way. Number 10. 1 revolution per second. March 16th, 1966. Neil Armstrong, 3 years before he becomes the most famous human being alive, is in orbit aboard Gemini 8 with his crewmate David Scott, and they have just done something nobody has ever done. They have flown up to an uncrewed target vehicle called the Agena and physically docked with it. The first joining of two spacecraft in orbit. A genuine milestone. They get about 27 minutes of triumph. Then the stack, the two joined ships, starts to roll. Slowly at first. Scott notices they are drifting off their proper attitude, and Armstrong uses the thrusters to correct it. It corrects. Then it starts rolling again. This is the moment the day turns. They assume the problem is the Agena. It is the new, untested vehicle, after all. So they make the logical decision. They undock. They back away from the Agena to get clear of whatever is wrong with it. And the instant they separate, everything gets catastrophically worse. Because the problem was never the Agena. The problem was one of their own thrusters. A roll thruster on the Gemini, and it was stuck full open, firing continuously. While they were docked, the extra mass of the Agena had been damping the motion, slowing it down. The moment they let go of that mass, the Gemini was free to spin, and spin it did. The tumble rate climbed. It reached nearly 300 degrees every second. That is approaching 1 full revolution per second. Imagine sitting in a chair that is rotating almost once a second, end over end, and the stars and the earth are smearing into streaks outside your window, and your inner ear is screaming, and your vision is starting to narrow and dim at the edges because the spin is pulling the blood in your head around, and you are sliding toward blackout. Scott called down to the ground. "We have serious problems here. We're tumbling end over end up here." Calm voice. Impossible situation. Armstrong made the only move left. He shut down the entire main maneuvering system, the one with the stuck thruster, and switched to a completely separate set of thrusters, the ones reserved for re-entry. He was spending his return home fuel to stop the spin. And he did it. He wrestled the tumble down to nothing by hand, while half blind and being flung in circles. But the rules were absolute. Once you fire the re-entry control thrusters, once you dip into that reserve, you have to come home. Immediately. They had burned about 3/4 of it. So the first orbital docking in history ended a few hours later with an emergency splashdown in the Pacific, the crew safe, and a very quiet understanding at NASA that the man who had just kept himself alive through a 1 per second death spin might be worth keeping around. Number 9. The hatch that blew. July 21st, 1961. Gus Grissom has just flown a perfect suborbital hop. 15 minutes. Up and back down. The second American ever to fly in space. His little Mercury capsule, Liberty Bell 7, is now bobbing in the Atlantic, waiting for the helicopter to come lift it out of the water. This is the easy part. The dangerous flying is done, and then the hatch blows off. The Mercury hatch was held on by explosive bolts, designed to be blown deliberately from the inside if the astronaut needed to get out fast. Grissom was lying there, running through his post-landing checklist, waiting, and with a bang, the hatch fired. It shot off into the ocean, and the sea started pouring in. Now, everything happens at once. Water is flooding the capsule. Grissom does the only thing you can do, which is get out right now, and he scrambles through the open hatch into the swells. But his spacesuit is not sealed for swimming. There is an inlet valve open on it, and water begins working its way in, and the suit that is supposed to keep him alive starts pulling him down. Meanwhile, the recovery helicopter has hooked onto the capsule, but the capsule is now full of seawater and weighs far more than it should, and the helicopter is straining, warning lights coming on, unable to lift the flooded spacecraft and worried about crashing into the sea itself. So there are two emergencies at the same moment, a sinking spacecraft and a drowning astronaut, and the crews are focused on the spacecraft. Grissom is in the water, waving, going under, coming back up, his suit filling, and for a stretch of time, nobody is coming for him. He later said he had never been so scared in his life, and this is a test pilot who rode a rocket for a living. Eventually, another helicopter got a harness to him and hauled him out, exhausted and half-drowned, seconds from being lost. The capsule was not so lucky. They had to cut it loose, and Liberty Bell 7 sank about 3 miles to the bottom of the Atlantic, deeper than the Titanic, where it stayed for 38 years. And here is the cruelty of it. For decades, the story that stuck was that Grissom had panicked, that he had somehow blown the hatch himself, screwed up, nearly cost them the capsule. He spent years under that shadow. When they finally raised Liberty Bell 7 from the seafloor in 1999 and studied it, the evidence pointed the other way. The plunger you had to physically hit to blow the hatch would have left a nasty bruise on his hand, and there was no bruise. The likeliest cause was something external, a fault, a discharge, not the man. He did not panic. He nearly drowned because of a machine, and then he carried the blame for it anyway, quietly, for the rest of his life. Number 8. The Frozen Station. Early in 1985, the Soviet space station Salyut 7, empty at the time, with no crew aboard, simply stopped answering. A power failure cascaded through the station. The batteries drained, the radio went dead. And this 20-ton object, the size of a couple of buses, was left drifting in orbit, slowly tumbling, dark, silent, and freezing. A ghost ship. For the Soviets, this was a disaster and an embarrassment. And the fix they came up with is, to this day, probably the most difficult repair job ever attempted in space. They sent up 2 men, Vladimir Janibekov and Viktor Savinik, aboard a Soyuz, launched in June of 1985, with a mission that sounds simple and is nearly impossible. Go find the dead station, dock with it, and bring it back to life. Start with the docking. Every docking the Soviets had ever done relied on the target being alive. The station would talk to you, broadcast its position, help guide you in. Salyut 7 could do none of that. It was mute. It was tumbling. It was a lump of dead metal spinning slowly in the dark, and they had to fly up to it and physically connect with it using their own eyes and a handheld laser rangefinder, manually, closing the gap on a target that could not cooperate in any way. They did it. They caught the ghost. Then, they opened the hatch and floated inside, and it was like entering a tomb. The station was below freezing. The walls were coated in frost. Ice hung in the air and clung to the equipment. It was pitch dark. They went in wearing winter hats and heavy coats, and at first gas masks, their flashlight beams cutting through the cold, and they could see their own breath fogging in front of their faces inside a spacecraft. Everything was dead. Everything was frozen. And over about the next 10 days, these two men brought a corpse of a space station back to life. They could not just flip the power on. The batteries were ruined. So they wired fresh batteries directly to the solar panels, and they used the thrusters of their own Soyuz to physically turn the whole frozen station so its solar arrays faced the sun, so it could begin, slowly, to charge. Warmth came back, then power, then air, then water, as the ice melted off the walls and they had to chase floating globules of it through the cabin. They resurrected it. Salyut 7 flew again. We tell stories about explosions and fire because they are loud, but there is something colder and quieter, and just as brutal about two men floating into a frozen, silent tomb in orbit, breath fogging in the dark and refusing to let it stay dead. Number 7. The clot in orbit. This one is more recent, and in some ways it is the most unsettling on the whole list, because the emergency did not come from a rocket or a fire or a stuck thruster. It came from inside a human body, and nobody even knew it was happening. The setting is the International Space Station a few years ago, on an ordinary 6-month mission. One of the astronauts was taking part in a research study, the kind of thing they do constantly up there, on how blood and fluid shift toward the head in weightlessness. Down here, gravity pulls your blood toward your feet. Up there, it drifts upward, puffs up the face, fills the vessels in the neck. So, part of the study was simply doing ultrasound scans of the astronaut's own neck veins, guided from the ground. And on one of those scans, something showed up that should not have been there. A dark mass sitting in the left internal jugular vein, a blood clot, a deep vein thrombosis, forming in the neck of a perfectly healthy person who felt completely fine, about 250 miles above the Earth. This had never been seen before. The first known blood clot to form in space. Now think about the position that puts everyone in. A clot like this, on Earth, is a medical situation you take seriously immediately. Because if it breaks loose, it can travel to the lungs and kill you in minutes. And your patient is in orbit. There is no emergency room. There is no surgeon on board. There is no ambulance and no quick ride home. The nearest specialist is a whole planet away. So they did the only thing they could. They phoned a doctor, a clot expert on the ground. A hematologist named Stefan Moll was brought in to direct the treatment remotely from Earth for a patient he could never physically touch. He later said, only half joking, that his first instinct was to ask whether he could just go up to the station and examine the patient himself. They treated it with what they had. There was a supply of blood thinner on board, and the astronaut began injecting it, and then a fresh supply of an oral drug was flown up on the next cargo run. And the crew monitored the clot themselves, doing their own guided ultrasounds, watching this thing in their colleague's neck, hoping it would hold together and dissolve rather than break free. It worked. The astronaut came home safely, and the clot was managed the whole way down. But sit with the core of it for a second. It was found by accident. If that research study had not happened to be scanning that exact vein, nobody would have known the clot was there at all. The astronaut felt nothing, and the most dangerous thing on the space station that day was not the vacuum outside or the machinery around them. It was a silent little shadow inside one of their own bodies that they only saw because they happened to be looking. Number 6. The fire nobody could outrun. February of 1997. The Russian space station Mir. There are 6 people aboard, which was a record for the station at the time, and among them is an American astronaut Jerry Lininger and a cosmonaut named Alexander Lazutkin. With 6 people breathing, you need extra oxygen. So the station carried these devices, solid fuel oxygen generators, basically canisters, sometimes called oxygen candles, that you light to produce a fresh supply of air through a chemical reaction. It was a completely routine thing. Lazutkin went to light one, exactly as he had before, and this time, instead of quietly making oxygen, it ignited. Lininger described looking over and seeing a flame shooting out of the canister like a blowtorch, sparks and bits of molten metal spraying off it. He said it looked like a giant sparkler, a 4th of July sparkler, but 1,000 times more powerful. This is a fire, an open flame throwing sparks, inside a sealed metal can full of oxygen-rich air, in orbit, with nowhere for anyone to go. And here is the detail that turns a bad situation into a nightmare. Mir had 2 Soyuz escape craft docked to it, 2 lifeboats, because you needed enough seats to evacuate everyone if it all went wrong. But the fire was burning in a spot that blocked the path to one of those 2 Soyuz craft. Do the arithmetic on that. 6 people on board, 1 reachable lifeboat. If they had needed to abandon the station right then, they could not all have gotten out. Some of them would have had to stay behind on a burning station and hope. Thick smoke filled the modules. They pulled on respirators. They grabbed fire extinguishers and fought it, and there was a real question of whether the extinguisher spray would even work properly, because the fire was feeding on its own oxygen supply, not the cabin air. They kept at it, and eventually, after what felt like a very long time, the flame died. The fire itself was a matter of minutes, but the crisis, the smoke, the fear, clearing the air, went on far longer. Nobody died. Nobody was seriously hurt. And when the news first came out, the whole thing was publicly downplayed. A small fire, quickly handled, nothing to worry about. Lininger, who had watched a blowtorch throw molten metal a few feet from his face, while one of his 2 exits sat behind the flames, remembered it rather differently. Number 5. The re-entry they hid. April 12th, 1961. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human being ever to leave the Earth and orbit it. It is one of the genuine turning points in the history of our species. A man went to space and came back. The Soviet Union announced a flawless triumph. The flight was not flawless. The coming home very nearly killed him. Gagarin orbited once, and it went beautifully. The trouble started on the way down. His spacecraft, Vostok 1, was built in 2 parts. There was the round descent module, the ball he was riding in, and behind it an equipment module full of the gear he no longer needed for re-entry. Just before hitting the atmosphere, those 2 parts were supposed to cleanly separate so that only the protected ball went down through the fire. They did not cleanly separate. A bundle of cables between the 2 modules failed to let go, so instead of falling free, Gagarin's capsule stayed tethered to the equipment module behind it, the 2 of them joined by wires, and the whole ungainly assembly began to whip around. He started to spin. Hard. He described it later as being in a kind of cloud of fire, the world outside going bright and smearing as the capsule tumbled, pulling heavy G-forces on his body. Something in the region of 8 times normal gravity, pressing him down while everything rotated. He held on, and what eventually saved him was, of all things, the heat of re-entry itself. As the assembly plunged into the atmosphere, the fire burned through the stubborn cables. They finally severed. The equipment module fell away, the descent ball righted itself, and Gagarin, still inside, was now coming down properly. Except the flight was not designed for him to land inside the capsule at all. The plan, always, was for him to eject. And so at about 7 kilometers up, Gagarin was fired out of his own spacecraft and came down the rest of the way on a personal parachute, landing in a field near the Volga, where the first human to orbit the Earth startled a farmer and her granddaughter who had no idea who he was. And that ejection is the thing they hid. Because at the time, the international rules for setting an official aviation record required that the pilot land with his craft. If word got out that Gagarin had parachuted down separately, some bureaucrat somewhere might argue that his flight did not count, that the first human spaceflight had an asterisk on it. So the Soviets simply lied. For years, the official story was that Gagarin rode his capsule all the way to the ground. The violent spin, the cables that would not release, the ejection, all of it, quietly filed away so that the Triumph could stay clean. Number 4. The man who couldn't fit back in. March 18th, 1965. Alexei Leonov is about to do something no human has ever done. He is going to open a hatch and float out of his spacecraft and become the first person to walk in space. And for about 10 minutes, it is transcendent. He is out there, on the end of a tether, turning slowly above the blue curve of the Earth, weightless, the first man ever to simply be in the void. Then he tries to come back inside, and the void nearly keeps him. Here is what went wrong, and it is the kind of thing that sounds almost too simple to be deadly. Out in the vacuum, with nothing pressing in from outside, Leonov's spacesuit had inflated. It puffed up like a balloon. Suits do this. They hold pressure to keep you alive. And without the outside atmosphere to push back, his had swollen, rigid, and grown larger than when he left. His hands had pulled back out of the gloves. His feet had slid up out of the boots. The suit had become a stiff, oversized shell, and his airlock was a soft fabric tube, a specific size, that he now had to climb back through, except he no longer fit. The ballooned suit was too big for the opening. He was stuck outside his own ship, running out of time, and the one path back to air was a hole he could not squeeze into. So Leonov made a decision, alone, in the moment, that could have killed him a different way. He reached to a valve and began bleeding oxygen out of his own suit, letting his air, his life support, hiss out into space, deliberately, to deflate the suit enough to fit. Every bit he vented brought his suit down to size, and also pushed him toward the risk that divers know well, the bends, decompression sickness, nitrogen bubbling in the blood if you drop the pressure too fast. He did not have time to do it slowly. And he did not tell the ground he was doing it, because there was no procedure for any of this, and no time to discuss it. He just did it, and then forced himself back through the airlock head first, against every rule, and collapsed inside, soaked in his own sweat, alive. And if the story ended there, it would already belong on this list. It does not end there. Because the mission's troubles continued, and the automatic landing system failed, and Leonov and his crewmate Pavel Belyayev had to fire their retro-rockets manually, and came down far, far off target, thousands of kilometers from where anyone was waiting for them, deep in the snowbound forests of the Ural Taiga. In wolf country. In bear country. In March. Two men who had just made history sat in a freezing capsule in the middle of a Siberian wilderness for the better part of 2 nights, listening to the forest, waiting, while rescuers struggled through the trees, some of them on skis, to reach them. The first man to walk in space nearly died 3 separate ways in a single flight, and the world was told it went perfectly. Number 3. The slow death that almost was. Everybody knows Apollo 13. Houston, we've had a problem. An oxygen tank explodes on the way to the moon. The landing is scrubbed, and against all odds, the crew gets home. It has been called a successful failure, the finest hour, and it was made into a very good movie. And because we know it ends well, we tend to remember it as a clever engineering puzzle. A story about slide rules and duct tape and smart people in a room. What that version leaves out is how close these 3 men came to simply dying slowly, in the cold and the dark, over 4 days. The explosion happened on April 13th, 1970. It crippled the command module, the main ship. So the crew, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes, moved into the lunar module, the little lander named Aquarius, and used it as a lifeboat. The problem is that the lunar module was built to keep 2 men alive for a couple of days on the moon. Now it had to keep 3 men alive for 4 days across open space. So they powered it down to almost nothing to save every scrap of electricity and water for the systems that mattered. And the moment they did that, the cabin began to freeze. The temperature inside dropped to around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. There was no way to warm up. Condensation formed on every surface, the walls, the windows, the instrument panels, beating with cold water. The men could not sleep in it. They had brought no warm clothing worth the name. They just got colder and colder, shivering, exhausted, for days. Then there was the water. To save it, they cut their own drinking water down to almost nothing, roughly 6 ounces a person a day, a fraction of what a body needs. So on top of the cold, they were slowly dehydrating. Over the mission, the 3 of them lost a combined 31.5 pounds. Hayes lost so much he was gaunt, and the air was turning poisonous. Every breath they exhaled put carbon dioxide into the cabin, and the lunar module's scrubbers were not built to clean the air for 3 men this long. The carbon dioxide climbed toward levels that would have put them to sleep and never let them wake up. This is the famous duct tape moment. The mailbox they built to jam the command module's square scrubber canisters into the lunar module's round system, reading the instructions up from the ground. It worked. It pulled the poison back down, but it was that close. And through all of it, Fred Hayes was getting sick. The cold and the dehydration and the misery caught up with him, and he developed a urinary tract infection that worked its way up into a kidney infection. He ran a fever, burning up inside a freezing spacecraft, aching for the long ride home. He did not tell the ground how bad it was until later. They made it. On April 17th, they crossed back into the command module, powered it up, and it did not short-circuit despite being soaked in 4 days of condensation, which honestly should not have gone as smoothly as it did. And they splashed down alive. But the story is not really about duct tape. It is about 3 men, freezing, starving for water, breathing air that was slowly turning against them. One of them feverish and sick, holding on in the dark for 4 days. The movie gives you triumph. The truth gives you 3 people who very nearly went to sleep in the cold and never came back. Number 2. Drowning in the vacuum of space. There is no water in space. That is the whole point of it. The dryness, the emptiness, the vacuum. So there is a special kind of horror in the fact that in 2013, an astronaut on a spacewalk very nearly drowned inside his own helmet, hundreds of miles above the Earth, surrounded by the driest nothing that exists. His name is Luca Parmitano, an Italian astronaut with the European Space Agency, and it was his second ever spacewalk on July 16th, 2013, outside the International Space Station. About 44 minutes in, going about his tasks, he felt something odd. A wetness at the back of his head, inside the sealed helmet. Cold water pooling behind his neck. At first, nobody was too alarmed. Maybe his drink bag was leaking. Maybe it was sweat. But it kept coming. More water, gathering inside the helmet, and in weightlessness, water does not run down and drip away. It clings. It forms a growing blob held to the surfaces by nothing but its own tension. And that blob was spreading across the inside of his helmet, and, because he was floating, migrating toward his face. It crept over the back of his head. Then it reached his ears, and the sound of the world went muffled and strange. Then it slid forward across his eyes, and his vision blurred and then was gone. A film of water sitting directly over his eyeballs. Then it reached his nose. And that is the moment this stops being an inconvenience and becomes a way to die. Water over the nose and mouth, and no way to wipe it. No way to move it. No way to reach through a sealed, pressurized helmet and clear your own face. Parmitano later wrote something that is hard to shake. He said he could not even be sure that the next time he breathed, he would fill his lungs with air and not with liquid. The spacewalk was called off immediately. He had to get back to the airlock, but he now had water over his eyes and in his ears, so he was, for practical purposes, blind and half-deaf, on the outside of a space station, in a bulky suit, with the black of space on one side and the Earth on the other. He found his way back largely by feel. Feeling for the tethers and the handrails with his hands, remembering the path, dragging himself toward the hatch he could not see, while trying not to breathe in the water creeping around his face. He made it inside. They got the helmet off. There was somewhere between a liter and a liter and a half of water in it, and here's the part that should never have happened. The very same suit had leaked a small amount of water on the previous spacewalk, the week before, and it had been written off, waved away, blamed on a leaking drink bag, not investigated. So when Parmitano put that helmet on again, the fault was already there, waiting, and this time it nearly filled his helmet while he was outside. He did not almost drown because space is inherently a drowning place. He almost drowned because a warning had been ignored. Number 1. The 3 who died in silence. Everything else on this list is a near miss. A man who almost drowned. A crew that almost froze. A capsule that almost tore apart. We have been telling stories about the space between disaster and survival, and every time, at the last second, the survival won. Not this time. June of 1971. 3 Soviet cosmonauts, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, launched to the world's first space station, Salyut 1, and they lived aboard it for 23 days. That was a record. They spent longer in space than anyone ever had, running experiments, watching the Earth turn beneath them. 3 men alone in the first outpost humanity ever placed in orbit. By every measure, it was a triumph. And on June 30th, 1971, they climbed into their Soyuz capsule, undocked, and began the trip home. The re-entry was automatic, and it was, from the outside, perfect. As the capsule came down, the modules separated, right on schedule. But the shock of that separation, the firing of the small explosive charges that split the spacecraft apart, jarred open a valve. A little pressure equalization valve, meant to let outside air into the cabin much later, down near the ground. It opened early, high up, at around 168 kilometers, where there is no air at all. And through that open valve, the cabin's atmosphere began to hiss out into the vacuum. The crew wore no pressure suits. There had not been room for them. So there was nothing between these 3 men and the vacuum but the walls of the capsule and a valve that had just failed. The air left the cabin in under a minute. They would have had only seconds of useful consciousness, working in the dark and the noise to try to find and close a valve they could barely reach. And there was not enough time. There was never going to be enough time. And the capsule kept coming down. Perfectly. The parachute deployed on schedule. The soft landing rockets fired. It touched down gently on the flat Kazakh steppe, upright, intact, exactly where it was supposed to be. From the ground, from the recovery helicopters racing toward it, it looked like a complete success. A textbook return. For a few minutes, everyone believed the mission had ended in triumph, and somewhere people were already getting ready to celebrate. Then they opened the hatch. The 3 men were still in their seats, still strapped in. There were no dramatic wounds, no fire, no wreckage. They looked, by some accounts, almost peaceful, as if they might simply be resting. But they were gone. All 3 of them. The recovery team tried to revive them, and there was nothing to revive. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev had died quietly, in their couches, on the way home, and the machine had carried their bodies the rest of the way down so gently that no one on Earth knew until the door was open. To this day, they are the only human beings who have ever died in space itself, above the line where the atmosphere ends. And that is the thing that stays with me about all of this. We imagine that if something goes catastrophically wrong up there, there will be a signal, an alarm, a scream on the radio, a fireball across the sky that tells the world a tragedy has happened. But space does not owe us that. Space can take 3 people so silently, so cleanly, that the capsule keeps flying its perfect trajectory and lands on target and sits there in the morning light looking exactly like a victory. The universe is not cruel. It is just indifferent, and it is very, very quiet. And sometimes the worst thing that can happen has already happened, long before anyone down here has any reason to stop smiling. Thank you for watching and sticking till the end. We've got plenty more videos coming in the future. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss them. See you in the next one.